on this episode of Indiana Education Insight.
The last 10 years, I've been at Battelle for Kids. So I've overseen projects that were as large as 450,000 kids in an improvement consortium. I've worked with state education agencies, lots of local education agencies across the country. So it's been a great journey.
Every week, the Indiana Association of Public School Superintendents is taking you inside today's Indiana education collaboration and tomorrow's education trends. We're staying on the pulse of public school innovators throughout Indiana and beyond. Join our conversation and contribute to our upcoming topics at iapssin.org/podcast. Here's your host, Dr. J.T. Koopman.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Indiana Education Insight. I'm Dr. J.T. Koopman, Executive Director of the IPSS. This podcast is being delivered by our IPSS team and produced by our friends at Edge Media Studios. As Executive Director of IPSS, I'm excited to bring you this weekly show where we feature Indiana education innovators from all over our great state, from students to superintendents. We'll also be talking to higher education leaders and educators at the state level as we work together as proactive public education advocates. That's why IPSS is here and why we're proud to bring you this show. Every week, we're talking about trending topics in the public education space while bringing in education innovators to hear their perspective. As with any organization, it takes great leadership to be successful, and that is one of the main missions of IPSS, developing great school district leaders. It is always great to have experienced and passionate educators joining the show, so let's get started with today's conversation.
Topics and trends in Indiana education.
Today's guest is Mr. Tony Bagshaw, Chief Improvement Officer with Battelle for Kids. Mr. Bagshaw has been a teacher, a principal, and a central office administrator in Indiana and Ohio, as well as numerous public speaking engagements. So he has been very instrumental in shaping the conversation about Indiana public schools and has the ability to look at education from various lenses, which is very important. Of course, he has been a tremendous asset to public education in Indiana. So let's find out how he views issues in Indiana public schools. Welcome, Mr. Bagshaw. We're very thrilled to have you with us on today's show. So if you could, tell us a little bit about your background and your various roles in other states with Battelle for Kids.
Sure. Well, my roots in Indiana run very deep. On the way up, I was calculating, and I think between my parents, my wife and I, and our oldest daughter, I think we have 9 degrees from Indiana institutions.
Wow.
So I grew up in Henryville. My parents were both teachers for 35 years. I'm very proud of the fact that the job I've still held the longest in my career is a classroom teacher in Indiana. I've been a coach, teacher, and an administrator at all 3 levels, elementary, middle, and high.
Okay.
Been a central office administrator. Never been a superintendent. For the last 10 years, I've been at Battelle for Kids. So I've overseen projects that were as large as 450,000 kids in an improvement consortium. I've worked with state education agencies, lots of local education agencies across the country. So it's been a great journey.
Well, if you could please tell us a little bit about Battelle for Kids and how it got started and what its mission is and maybe some of the things that they do, because I understand that it's an international organization.
Yeah, our mission statement is to collaborate with school districts to bring the power and promise of 21st century learning to every student. So that's sort of what we're all about. The organization started in 2001. We have worked internationally, Hong Kong. We've worked all over the country. I think we've been in 36 states, a wide array of undertakings.
Mm-hmm.
Very passionate about portrait of graduate work, very passionate about strategic planning. And it's been a great evolution. Really, we're an innovation and implementation organization. So if school districts or states are out there trying to do things that are pushing the envelope a bit, that's where we fit.
Okay. All right. Obviously not in Indiana.
Actually, we have done work in Indiana. We've worked with some of our smaller rural districts in Indiana, and we certainly we worked in Elkhart to help them with their strategic plan. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it's possible we'll be working in one of our large urbans here very soon.
Okay, that's great. So as you have stated, you have an interest in helping Indiana schools and school districts across the country in a variety of ways. So, based on your experiences, why do you think school reform is such a challenge, and what opportunities do you see for transforming educational opportunities for our students?
Yeah, I think school reform is a challenge for really, I think there are basically three reasons. One is that school reform doesn't travel well. When I say school reform, everybody thinks about the school they went to. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's normal human behavior. It's availability bias. But the truth is that school districts have very different needs. They function very differently. So the things that are appropriate for Henryville, where I grew up,
Right.
may or may not fit in Fort Wayne, and they operate very, very differently.
Sure.
So copying, I don't think works well in school
Right.
reform space. I think the second challenge is that it's difficult to quantify what we do. These days, I end up speaking with a lot of business leaders, and I'm not one of those people who believes everything in business works in education, nor the other way.
Sure.
But having said that, the one thing we always agree on that if you are in business, it's easy to quantify what you do.
Sure.
You're in business to make money, and that's okay. It's a capitalist society.
Right.
But we're in the business of growing humans, and that's tough. It's tough to quantify that. I always use an example of, my oldest daughter ended up singing in Perdettes through a lot of theater experiences. It's had an immeasurable impact on her life. I can't show that in a test score,
Right.
but I certainly know what she would say and what we would say as a family. It's been very impactful. I think the third thing that makes it really tough with ed reform is we've known since the 60s, it's just really tough to parse out the impacts of poverty on children in school districts. I don't want anybody to think I'm sitting here saying that children living in poverty can't learn, because nothing is further from the truth. But it is true that those children tend to bring some challenges in their backpacks and require additional resources to do that. And so, that it certainly impacts the context.
Sure. Yeah. We at least certainly in the state of Indiana, we seem to have much more legislative engagement in the educational process than we've ever had before. Can you identify maybe some reasons why our legislators and legislators in other states feel compelled to get involved in the educational arena?
I don't know. I'm not a legislator. And I think that most of it is likely done because it's so important. And I mean, I think everybody sees that, the trajectory of a child's life is going to be determined by, their education level to a great degree. So everybody thinks it's really important. And those are the kind of things that legislatures tend to get involved in.
Right.
I think one of the challenges for legislators, and I would say the same challenge for state education agencies, is again the diversity of school districts. So you're trying to make policy that applies broadly, and sometimes that fits the context and sometimes it doesn't. And it also, in my opinion, goes back to that second challenge and trying to really quantify the good things that are going on in school districts. We know that test scores have been a driver of ed reform for us now since 2002. I frankly would not want to go back to the days where there wasn't any accountability in schools, because I think there's been some good things.
Absolutely.
NCLB has shined a light on every child, and that's a good thing for us.
Right.
But I also think that it's tough to argue that it didn't narrow the curriculum. It's tough to argue that the state accountability hasn't been good in some circumstances, but I do think it needs to get rebalanced.
Sure.
I think that the research base is pretty clear that the accountability that we impose on ourselves is more powerful than that comes to us from outside the system.
Yep.
So I probably dodged your legislative question a bit, but that's the best I've got.
No. That's fine. You've mentioned the differences in school communities, and we certainly, half the school districts in the state of Indiana are 1,500 students or less. But we also have some very large school districts, and the differences and the location of those school districts vary greatly. And so, how can we re-engage local communities around the value of public education?
Well, we've got some pretty strong ideas about that, and we believe really strongly in the notion of and the concept of a portrait of a graduate. I just shout out to my friends in Kettering, Ohio. We just rolled out their portrait of a graduate last Thursday, and I saw the powerful impact that can have on a community. We had 881 community members weigh in on that endeavor.
How many? 181?
881.
800.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
We were very pleased. And it really starts with this with stepping back and looking at some big societal trends. The world is not the same place it was, JT, when you and I graduated from high school.
Yep.
And saying, okay, if we know these huge societal trends to be truth, what's the impact on what we want for our students? And we've got a great website. If anybody wants to check it out, if you Google "portrait of a graduate," it will take you to the website. There's a huge amount of free resources there. They can look at other people's portraits. The portrait itself has real value. It becomes your North Star of what you want for your kids. But the process one uses to get to that portrait, in my mind, is just as important, because that committee done well will be made up of civic leaders, of kids, of teachers, of administrators, business leaders, everybody coming together to have that conversation around what are our kids really need. And for me, one of the most gratifying things about last Thursday was watching a high school student get up in front of all those people and say, here are the experiences we need to be successful in the future.
Yep.
That's powerful.
That is powerful. That is powerful. I want to touch base a little bit more on the elements in the portrait of a graduate, but I also want to kind of speak to the fact that for so long it appears that we have had a one-size-fits-all and all kids go to college. And we know that as educators that's not the case, and not all kids need to go to college. So in Indiana, we're kind of changing that mindset, and that reference is that not all kids need to go to college, because we have a lot of kids that maybe shouldn't be going to college. They don't want to go to college, and we also have a workforce that is going unfilled.
Right.
So we're kind of changing the direction in how we're viewing education in the state of Indiana with workforce development. Do you have any comments around those two elements, with the one-size-fits-all or allowing kids to choose a different path?
Yeah, I was excited to see the new graduation requirements. I think it seems to be headed in the right direction. The other thing that folks have to think about is that college has gotten really expensive.
Yeah, very expensive.
As the father of three, I know this. And it's gone up. I don't want anybody to quote me, but I'm in the ballpark here. It's gone up like 1,700% inflation adjusted since the early 80s.
Yeah.
So you're talking, you're talking about, if you believe that's the right path for your child,
Sure.
It's just a really big investment. You better be right.
Yeah.
And yet over here, to your point, we've got huge shortages in, what you and I would consider the traditional trades: plumbers, electrician, heavy equipment operators, et cetera.
Yep.
And those industry credentials often have tremendous economic value for kids.
Yep.
So it's I think families and schools we just have to get a little more sophisticated about those conversations. I sort of, with our own, we think of it as sort of this Venn diagram of what do you do really well, what do you have some interest and passion around,
Right.
and what will the world pay you to do? I am a big fan of gainfully employed children. And I think schools I think we're getting better at that. And I think we have to have authentic conversations in there. I do think that for a living wage job, there's going to require some form of advanced credentialing, and I really applaud all of our local school district in Lawrenceburg is doing a tremendous job with dual credit and getting kids there quicker to lessen the burden on families.
Sure.
And even if we send them to college, everybody needs to understand 50% of the kids don't graduate.
Yep.
So it's just a big risk financially for the families.
Absolutely.
So I think Indiana, I think it's a step in the right direction.
So with that in mind, we know that there's going to be kids that have an interest in skilled trades and some other things, but we also have kids that are going to be great college students and do great things for our country and in our communities. So what does that portrait of a graduate look like?
Well, you're setting a North Star for a kid, right? So it's by definition, you're normally, a lot of them will land on things that we talk about, the 4 C's. You know,
Right.
you're talking about creative thinking. You're talking about communication skills, the ability, to collaborate. But a lot of times we get into these, and this won't surprise you any. I mean, in our country right now, we have a great deal of it's this or it's this.
Right.
And people will oftentimes turn that into an or conversation, and I don't think the research base supports that. I think we can design experiences for kids that we can still get those rigorous academic outcomes.
Right.
That's not going to go away.
Yep.
You cannot be creative around something that you know nothing about. So that stuff is still important.
Yep.
But I think these other things, it can be brought into it. I do think it has some pretty big implications for how we lead buildings, how we lead districts,
Sure.
those things we value, and lesson design itself.
Yeah.
So the portrait of a graduate itself will end up being, you need to get it down to one page, and it needs to be a graphic.
Sure.
That people can look at, and then that becomes, you sort of back map everything from there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There are some other programs that I am aware of that are similar to the portrait of a graduate, and one of them that I like in particular is college, career, and life ready. And so it used to be just college and career ready, but adding that and life ready is an important component, because there's more to life and living than just being taught how to do a job or
Absolutely.
graduating from college. So I really like that element about that. So another part of what we have discussions about is in Indiana, and I'm sure in several other states, is that we're seeing a teacher shortage. And so as we appear to be seeing some significant human capital issues around teachers and school leaders and bus drivers and substitute teachers in American public education, why do you believe this is true, and what can we do about it?
Well, there's certainly no shortage of opinions around that topic.
That's true.
And I think a lot of people aren't aware. They're just not aware that we're facing this.
Yep.
I can send you today to multiple chief talent officers in places that, as we sit here in February, they have classrooms that have not had a credentialed teacher in them today.
Right.
And we've always had sort of the typical suspects, shortages in special ed, secondary mathematics, physics.
Yep.
Chemistry. All of those
Mhm.
are where we compete against industry for
Yep.
those kids. But we're seeing it show up now. I mean, we're seeing some catastrophic drops in some states, and it's showing up. It's also starting to show up in leadership ranks
Yep.
as well. So there's no shortage of why, but you can't deny it's true. It's simple numbers. So I do think we have to step back and ask ourselves: why is this no longer a profession that people want to go into?
Yeah.
Because I loved being a teacher. I loved being a school administrator. All of my 21 years as a practitioner, I loved them all.
Sure.
And I do, if Daniel Pink had it right, if you're a Pink fan, if people want autonomy, mastery, and purpose in their jobs, education has all those things. So I think it's been a tough profession for the last 15 years or so. I think We have, for the first time in America, we have more children living in poverty in American public schools than not. So I think the job has gotten a bit more challenging. I think if kids are going to compete and be happy, productive citizens, we have to get them to higher levels than we've ever gotten them before.
Yep.
And yet, at the same time, now we have this human capital pool that is not serving us. And that scares me. You know, that scares me for the profession long term. And I think there is some promise, though, if you really get to it and you ask parents what they want for their kids, you ask kids what they want in a learning experience, and you ask the business leaders what they want in the employees, it's the same thing.
Sure. Yeah.
It's not like there's great disagreement here.
Right.
So I do think we have an opportunity here to re-energize the profession, and to be blunt, JT, we better take it.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with you. I have an opportunity later this week to discuss with a group of colleges that do teacher preparation, and they're going to ask me for suggestions about how we get the tide turned on the teacher shortage. Do you have any suggestions for me to share with them?
Yeah, I have two. The first one we already discussed. I think what instruction looks like needs to get back to where there's more creativity and autonomy in the instruction. But I think we have work to do. I think we have work to do with the current workforce. And if you're a Gallup person, you know, and you like employee engagement, which I happen to be one of those people, it's not an overly engaged profession right now. And I hear way too much of people who are practitioners saying, "Don't do that. You don't want to do that, and you don't want to be in this profession." And I think we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves why.
Yeah. I agree.
You know, and
You know, it's a sad day as long-serving professional educators that some of our colleagues are saying to their students, their children, their nieces, their nephews, is you probably need to rethink something if you're thinking about going into education. And we're going to see generations of children harmed as a result of this. And I just hope that we can get the ship turned and the ship righted before we harm too many others. And
we did. There's a couple of places that I'm starting to see some somewhat promising turning of data in pre-service. I pray it's a national trend, but I don't know.
Right. Yep. Well, I just hope that I can face this audience of college educators that are committed themselves to the best teacher preparation that they know how to do, but they need to have students in their classrooms in order to have them hone their craft.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, granted, there's been some things that maybe colleges haven't done well to keep up with, you know, current trends in the classroom, but I think they're getting that now and doing a better job with it. So I just hope we can get some things turned around there. So we've talked about the portrait of a graduate. What's next?
Well, after you've sort of defined that North Star, we recommend that you go into a robust strategic planning process. And when you say strategic planning, you get a lot of eye roll. and if you start unpacking that with people, they've usually had one of two kind of negative experiences with strategic planning. One is the strategic plan done in isolation, where we already knew what we wanted to do, and we're
done to them.
Yeah, exactly. We're just bringing this to you so you can bless it.
Right.
Okay. And the other one is the strategic plan that was done in an authentic way, and then it sits on the shelf and collects dust, and it never gets revisited, or we have some sort of a change in the district that, oh, that's out the door and we're not going to do that anymore. One of the things I like about the portrait of a graduate is when it's done, we strongly recommend that the board adopt it.
Sure.
Okay, so it can define that strategic plan. But then a strategic plan, I mean, school districts are systems of systems, right? So then it's about, okay, if this is what we want ultimately as an outcome, how do we start lining everything up? To your point, there are human capital implications of this. There are clear robust conversations that have to occur about assessment and what does that look like,
Right.
because that's a different, that's different.
Yeah.
So the things I advocate for portrait of graduate would be the same with strategic planning. You've got to have a broad stakeholder group.
Yep.
Don't rush it. We like to do 18 months. You can get it done in 12 if you really hustle. But if you're going to do it well and you're going to include people broadly so that you have the base
Yep.
to actually execute on it after it's done,
Sure.
it's going to take a while.
Yep.
And they're always going to have things like a financial responsibility component. You owe that to your taxpayers.
Yep.
So it's not that they're all so radically different. Whether or not it's good always comes down to how rigorous are your goals,
Mm-hmm.
how hard are you willing to push yourself,
Yep.
how do you know you're accomplishing something,
Mm-hmm.
and how often are you going to revisit this thing?
Right.
I when I start with strategic planning, I like to look at folks and say, is this something you're doing, or is this what you're doing?
Yep.
And if you're going to do it well, it better be the second answer.
Yep. That's right. That's right. So in the strategic planning process in most school systems, they focus on things from, you mentioned, fiscal responsibility to student outcomes to human capital management. So let's take a look at these issues in greater detail with school districts in Indiana and across the country struggling to attract and retain teachers, school leaders, and all of those other things that lack of money. So many roadblocks appear to be challenges for school districts. So we're asking them to do a lot more with a lot less. So how do you answer that question?
I'll start with the human capital piece. There are two challenges in there. Challenge one is if I don't have a pool of candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's there are some creative things that can be done around there, but in general, we push people to think about it as a comprehensive system.
Mm-hmm.
The human capital pillar is just one thing that supports your outcomes you want to get for graduates.
Sure.
So we happen to think it's a really important pillar, but it's just one. So we push people to say, okay, think of this comprehensively. Okay, how are you aligning to your portrait of a graduate outcomes? What are all the systems that how do you find talent? How do you grow it once you have it?
Right.
And then how do you keep it?
Yep.
Because we see that, in certain places we see if you're really, really good at finding talent and growing it and not keeping it, you're going to become somebody else's farm team.
That's right.
So there are specific strategies that work across the board. For instance, branding. Most districts don't do a tremendous job, and if you look at their website and their materials that they take to recruiting fairs, etc., they don't have a consistent feel and a consistent message across those. So that's just one example.
Yep.
I talked earlier about engagement. I really push folks to find a tool they're comfortable with and measure internal employee engagement and get serious about it.
Sure.
and do something about it.
Yep.
Because if you do all these wonderful things for external stakeholders, but the people that work for you are going to the soccer field every Saturday and saying, I don't like working there, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know, there's a couple of strategies there that, it's a comprehensive approach, and there are things that can be done, creative things that can be done to help address it.
Right.
But the ultimate solution is we need to figure out a way to flood this profession with talent.
Yep.
So that the big national distribution, we've got enough talent to. You're not going to get the results you want for your kids if you don't have a great teacher in every classroom and a great leader in every building.
That's right.
That's just the way it works.
That's just the way it works.
Yep.
And the other part of that is not only the administrative leadership, but I believe in the concept of teacher leaders. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have the power of the teacher leader, most of your innovations and initiatives are probably not going to work because they have to buy it, they have to sell it, and they have to believe in it. And so I'm also a strong proponent of developing those teacher leaders to help with any initiative that the administration wants to do. So we've talked about creating that student graduates so they're ready for college, they're ready for a career, they're ready for the military, they're ready for a workforce. Now, the big question is, what do kids really need to become lifelong learners and contributors in our society?
That's a 60. I'll date myself. That's a $64,000 question, right? I think the four C's do go a long way. I'm still going to put rigorous academic outcomes in there. I think you can't get away from
Right.
that. You have to be able to write.
Sure.
There's
Yeah.
certain content that still is always going to matter. And even if you go to the other route, and if you decide, hey, I want to be in HVAC, you got to know the stuff.
Yeah.
You got to know the
You
content
have to have
itself.
certain skill sets to
Absolutely.
be able to do.
But I think the four C's, I do think it does a nice job of framing it.
Yep.
When we're talking about the ability to collaborate, communicate, be creative,
Yep.
and to do complex problem solving.
Yep.
So I think those are good. I've got some personal things that matter to me. So you're getting a bit of the world according to Tony here. My personal ethos has always been work hard, be curious, leave the world a better place than you found it,
Yep.
and surround yourself with people who want to do the same.
Yep.
I'm going to be curious to see how outcomes for kids. If I don't think it's any secret to anybody that we need to get serious about emotional and mental health in this country.
Oh my goodness.
And
Absolutely.
so and to me, back to your point about just having a good job is not the measure of a great life. Okay, there are other things that really matter, and having a great emotional journey and to be balanced so you can contribute. You can't make the world a better place if you're not emotionally and mentally healthy.
Yep.
So I will, and I think again, a little bias here. My wife works for Cincinnati Public Schools and works transitioning preschoolers into their system, and she sees some of the challenges there with some of the resources,
Oh, my goodness.
and that mental health system is really burdened right now in
Yep.
America. So I think we've got to have, as a society, we've got to have some authentic conversations there.
Yeah, we sure do. And the same thing is happening in the mental health profession. It's happening in a teaching profession. Is they're underpaid and overworked, and so consequently, some of our talented individuals that could do that job well are going, I'm not doing that. I'm going to be doing something else where I can put food on the table and pay my rent.
Yeah.
And
So I mean, I think there's some we could all agree on. That's one I'll just put out there that I'll just be curious where that goes.
yeah, well, certainly in the conversations that are happening in light of what happened last week in Florida with
Tragic.
with the school shootings, is that conversation is going to come to the forefront. And you were talking about the early 2000s. Well, the early 2000s is also when mental health funding suffered dramatic funding decreases. And so over the course of time, we're seeing more and more people with mental health issues that are now in school, and there's nobody there to deal with them. So it's a perplexing and interesting problem. Something that we really haven't talked about is that we live in a test-based accountability system, and that's been a big driver of school reform over the last couple of decades. So as school systems work to provide an educational experience that prepares students to be lifelong learners and contribute to the 21st century, how do we rethink this mode of accountability?
Yeah, as I said, I think there just needs to be a little more balance. I'm a big advocate of we go to the community. I've used the word let's recapture this conversation. And, I think about, I always keep this stat. And, when you look at the PDK poll, and for like 25 years, right, if you ask people what they think about those public schools that are out there, they don't score them very well.
Right.
Usually around a D. But when you ask them about the public school their oldest child attends, so the one they actually know about,
Yep.
it goes B plus, A minus.
Right. Yep.
And so I think that we need to capture that spirit. And again, to me, I absolutely understand why you have state accountability systems. And I'm not an advocate of just saying we're not doing that anymore. But I think locally, we have to define what do we want for our kids.
I agree.
Because again, first of all, it's affirming. You know, we decided we wanted to do this ourselves.
Yep.
And secondly, it's contextual.
Well, this is what our community wants for their children and for our schools to be about. So I absolutely agree with that. And more school districts need to be doing that. I know of some districts that are doing that, and it seems to be working.
Yeah.
And-
Well, every community has different assets, right? If you have an institution of higher education in your community or near, that's a different context.
Yep.
If you've got a large-scale manufacturer in your community or near, that's a different context. So to me, it just makes sense to say, okay, let's keep our eye on these things that we are held accountable to,
Yep.
but let's also define some things locally that we care about.
Right.
You know, you're in, at times I'm in communities where the arts programs are they're unbelievable.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
They're just unbelievable. And so, you can tell the sense of community pride. You can see the experiences the kids are having. Well, you need to capture that. That needs to be part of your local brand, for lack of a better term.
Right. I agree with you. And we have, you know, the left brain kids and the right brain kids, and those opportunities need to be presented to the children that operate in those spheres. And so, you know, we're getting ready to adopt some things, and I'm fearful that especially the performing arts and the fine arts are going to get kind of lost in that. And I certainly don't want that to happen. You have a daughter that obviously
Actually, I have three. You're talking to the dad of three vocal music theater kids who the experiences they've had and the richness that has brought to their lives has been
phenomenal.
just phenomenal. I mean, it's just shaped them as human beings.
Yep.
And so, yeah, we're kindred spirits on that.
Yeah, so we have to keep our eye on that ball, and hopefully it's not going to get lost in some conversations here, especially in the state. So Battelle for Kids recently merged with Ed Leader 21. So what is the goal of that merger, and why do you think that's important?
Well, it was easy. It's two very like-minded organizations. And so we just launched a national campaign at AASA. It is how about I say it's very aspirational.
Okay.
We're trying to get to a point where 21% of the districts in America will have a portrait of a graduate for their students by 2021.
Okay.
Ed Leader 21, they've done incredible work in that space for a long time. And we think it's the right work. So it just made a lot of sense to bring those two organizations together.
Yep.
I won't cover the portrait of a graduate work again, but I will refer people back to the website that there's an actual counter on there. And so those districts out there that are, you know, you've got some Indiana members in Ed Leader 21. South Allen, I know, is a member and is doing great work. So it just made a lot of sense from our perspective, and they've been tremendous partners, and we had a great AASA and just excited about moving the work forward.
Oh, good, good. You know, with that in mind, and we can certainly talk about this at another point in time, but I'm going to kind of throw this out there, unexpected to you, but would love to have this presented at our annual conference.
Yeah, we'd be happy to.
I think that's something that all of our members need to know about and need to hear about, and at least evaluate.
Sure.
And so perhaps we can get that on our calendars and get you scheduled to do something. Maybe not you personally, but somebody from your organization.
Oh no, if it happens in Indiana, I'd prefer to do it.
All right.
You might get stuck with me.
No, I'm not being stuck. I know your work. So in closing, what advice do you have for Indiana school leaders?
Go to your community, re-engage them in the process, and I understand that work is going on. But I think now's the time. I think you've got these new graduation requirements on the horizon. I think you've got a grand opportunity here to discuss what do you want for your kids.
Sure.
You've got you're going to have to make changes anyway.
Yep.
So why not use that as an opportunity to really, really have a thorough community conversation.
Sure.
Don't be afraid to stand on the rooftops and tell everybody what your kids are doing.
Yeah.
We see some amazing student profiles, and I do believe educators in America are getting out of bed every day to try to do good things for kids.
Well, and you talk about shouting from the rooftops. School system leaders and teachers and principals, I don't think we do a good job of telling our story.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do a better job of telling our story. And actually, that's one of the reasons that I developed this podcast, is to kind of get the word out about the high-quality public schools that we have here in the state of Indiana, and some of the agencies that we work with, and some of the things that we're doing is to try to tell that story, because we don't do a good enough job with that.
Well, my experience so far has been that you're exactly right, and it's somewhat limited. We've worked in Elkhart, we've done work in Fort Wayne, but the people I meet there are, they're passionate educators who they're deeply invested in their communities, and they want good things for their kids.
Absolutely.
And I do think we need to do a little better job of perhaps having our narrative out there, when at times the narrative is not as positive as I personally think it should be.
Well, and if somebody doesn't tell our story, somebody else will tell it.
Someone's always telling the story. It might as well be you.
That's right. I would much rather see that. Well, I want to thank Mr. Bagshaw for being our guest on IPSS's edition of Indiana Education Insight. Now it's time to wrap up this episode with my take on the current state of affairs in Indiana education landscape.
Dr. JT's closing comments.
Although you pointed out that accountability is still important, but there are many factors going into preparing our students to become lifelong learners and contributors through the 21st century. As such, we need to begin to change the dialogue. We also discussed the teacher shortage, and we need to address the human capital issues and rebrand the profession of education. As such, we need to change the dialogue. Due to the complexities associated with the school reform, we need to engage our communities and have them come to us and help us develop the portrait of a graduate. As such, the process is very important as the final product. We need to change the dialogue. Throughout this public dialogue, it is my hope we can get our legislators and our state leaders to see the value of public schools and the nexus of promoting public schools as economic development tools in Hoosier communities. I see these as investments in our children and our state, and not as an expenditure. Perhaps we can pursue this issue and others in another segment. On our next show, we welcome Dr. Linda Mars Morford, the Executive Director of the Indiana Principal Leadership Academy. Perhaps she can provide some additional insight into the State House and education. Join us for that and more on the next Insight into Indiana Education. Thanks for being part of education. Please stand up for Indiana Public Schools.